In this video, we're going to give an overview of sub-council area population projections, specifically a project the Improvement Service carried out in August 2020 together with the National Record of Scotland. To give an overview of what the video will cover, we're going to talk a bit about the projections that we published last year in August, what these projections are, how they're produced, why they're relevant, and how you could maybe make use of them in your own work. So to start, what are we talking about when we say sub-council area population projections? Well, in terms of sub-council, all we mean there is any smaller areas within Scottish councils. So that could be anything from a postcode, a data zone, up to much larger areas. In this case, as we'll touch on, we're primarily talking about multi-member wards. The reason we use multi-member wards, we don't want the areas to be too small usually, but they can be from very small areas. And population projections, what we mean there is estimates of future population size broken down usually by age and by sex. And a point I'll say now, and I'll repeat again, these are not forecasts. They're not what we expect to happen. They are generally a continuation of current trends into the future. And they tell us what the population might look like if those trends were to continue. So how are populations calculated? Theoretically, it's quite a simple process. You take your population, so in this case, say this could be 2019. You age everyone by 1 year. You add in all the births, and you take out all the deaths. You add in all your immigrants coming from outside your population, your geography of interest, and you take away all your emigrants who've left your geography of interest. Usually you would break down your migration internal, so moving within, say, the United Kingdom, and external, so those coming from outside the UK. But in this case, in our population projections, we haven't been able to do that. We simply cover net migration from in total. And you repeat this process again and again until you get to your target year. I should say there's multiple ways to calculate births, deaths, migration. Usually you would use a 5-year average, that's what we've done, but they're usually almost always based on past trends like that. As I mentioned before, they also don't take into account any policy decisions, so they don't say what we think might happen, but they are based on those trends. Those trends can be slightly adjusted, so you might expect, for example, a lower rate of births or a higher death rate. And you can build those in and compare what different outcomes might be based on different assumptions. There are also a group of what are called special populations. These are students, usually university students, prisoners, and armed forces. Of course, these groups all have births, they die, they might move around potentially, but they do act slightly differently from the general population. And so usually what happens is these groups are taken out at the beginning of this process and then added back in. In these projections I'm going to talk about now, in the Improvement Service projections, we didn't actually have access to up-to-date student populations, and we didn't have access to the armed forces at all. And so we just treated these two population groups as normal populations, and we did include prisoners. We did include prisoners as a special population, although this only affects quite a small number of areas where prisons are actually situated. And the last thing to say is we also, and I'll talk about this later on as well, we also ensured that our projections were constrained to match the National Records Council area population projections. So our projections don't go any higher than them, or they don't go any lower than them. They're exactly the same at a council level. Now, you could do that process manually, but that might be quite time consuming. And so usually you would use a software called PopGroup. PopGroup is designed specifically to do population forecasts. It's owned by the LGA and it was developed by Ludie Simpson at the University of Manchester. It's Excel based. It's relatively straightforward to use, but there's a great deal of training resource available online, including via the National Records of Scotland, who have a whole section dedicated to using PopGroup and have run training courses in person in the past. So you could use a population projection software like PopGroup to, for example, calculate your own assumptions. For example, you might suspect there would be a higher death rate in areas as a result of the COVID pandemic, and so you might want to forecast what those areas' population will look like in the future. Now, to move on and talk about our projects, the National Records of Scotland, they do routinely produce Scotland and council level population estimates every single year. And they also do population projections every 2 years for those same areas for Scotland and for councils. They did produce a one-off set of sub-council area projections back in 2016. However, they don't have any capacity to produce these routinely. But what we also know is that local authorities' access to PopGroup and the capacity to publish projections really varies. So that's where this project came from. We know there's a continued demand for projections from local authorities, and that's for a number of reasons: to support the planning of service delivery at a local level. Councils really need to know what their population within different areas might look like and how it's likely to change over time. So the National Records of Scotland began developing quite a broad package of support for local authorities and others in sub-council area population projections, and that included training in PopGroup, for example. They also included Approaching Improvement Service to produce a standard set of sub-council area population projections to kind of help fill the evidence gap for those who might not have the capacity to produce projections themselves. There were multiple reasons for us doing that. So it was hoped that the projections and the user support would help councils to understand the future size and makeup of their populations and what might look like in different local areas. And that would help them prepare for demographic change in the future and to meet the challenges that poses to service delivery. By producing a national set that's based on the same assumptions also allows some comparison of small areas between local authority areas. And this project was the first time anything like this has been done anywhere within the UK. So one of the first questions we had to ask was, what geographies, what areas will we use to do these projections? And we didn't want to be prescriptive. We wanted local authorities to be able to have their own say about what kind of geography would be most suitable for them and for their local areas. So what we decided to do was we'd started by having a default geography, which was multi-member wards. And the reason that we chose this is because all local authorities have them, so they're applicable to all local authority areas. They are a relatively large size, which is important for population projections. And you can also nest smaller geographies within these, so it was easy enough to calculate what their populations would look like. Now, 6 local authorities did ask to use alternative geographies. So 3 wanted to use housing market areas, 1 local authority used community planning partnership locality areas, 1 used community areas, and 1 had their own bespoke neighbourhoods. And just to say, this is Glasgow's multi-member wards to give you an idea of what they look like. So the time period covered by our projections was from mid-2018 through to mid-2030. The reason we started in mid-2018 is we used the mid-year estimates from 2018, which was the most recent that was available, and we used these to aggregate up to our custom geographies, for example. And the reason we picked 2030 as our end date is just because the further you go into the future, the less accurate projections are likely to be. And so 2030 was felt like a good cut-off point for that. We're also constrained, and I mentioned this before, we also constrained our projections to be consistent with the most recent National Records of Scotland's population projections for Scotland as a whole and for council areas. And what I mean there is, because each sub-council area is projected individually, the sum of population projections for each small area could be higher than the projections calculated for the total local authority as projected by the National Records of Scotland. So we slightly adjust the numbers to make sure that when you add up all your sub-council areas, they always match the National Records of Scotland's projection for that whole area. And they will then eventually add up to match your Scotland level figure as well. Just a couple of other points about these projections. So projections are trend-based. They make assumptions about future levels of fertility, mortality, and migration based upon trends from the previous 5 years preceding the projections. So in our case, that covered the period from 2013 through to 2018. The weakness of that approach is, of course, you might miss some shocks. So there has obviously been a major shock in 2020 that we couldn't account for, which was an increased death rate as a result of COVID-19. And projections then indicate what the future population would be if current trends were to continue. As I mentioned before, there's some scope to alter that, so you might want to project with a higher mortality rate or with a higher fertility rate. You may make other changes, and you can then compare what those different assumptions might have on future population size. But they don't take account generally of policy plans or economic changes that might happen. They're not forecasts about what we think will happen.
In these next two slides, we're just going to give you a little bit of a run through of what the projections actually show. So at the moment, we're just focusing on the whole of Scotland. So looking at those small areas across all 32 councils and what they show in terms of the change in population. So there was a total of 345 small areas projected in this project, and around half of them are expected to see an increase in their population between 2018 and 2024, whereas around the other half are expected to see population decline over that same period. So this just kind of gives you a sense of the variability you see between different small areas across Scotland, and we see a lot of that same variability even within councils. So looking at this graph on this right-hand side, you can see that the largest percentage growth across any of those small areas that we projected was 21.3% between 2018 and 2024, whereas the largest decline was actually 11.5%. So again, there's quite a lot of variability in the change that you anticipate to see across different population groups. And there's a lot of different variability that can play into those changes in population. So you'll have some areas where there's expected to be a lot of people moving into the area, or you might have areas where there's people are likely to move out and there's a higher number of deaths in the area perhaps. So this just gives you a sense of how these different populations are expected to change. And in this next slide, we're just having a look at dependency ratios. So dependency ratios just give a sense of how your dependent population, so populations that you expect to be using services such as earlier services or social care, things like that. So that dependent population and how that compares to your working age population. The dependent populations were aged 0 to 15 and 65 plus, and the working age population was 16 to 64. So looking at dependency ratio basically gives you a sense of what is the sort of impact your population will have on demand for public services. So your dependent population compared needing those services compared to those that are contributing to the local economy and potentially working in those services. So in our projections, if you look at the base year of 2018, the maximum dependency ratio across any of those small areas we projected was 47.6%, whereas in 2024, this maximum dependency ratio across the areas, the maximum across those areas has increased to 49.8%. So it just shows you that overall you're seeing a trend where there's a higher proportion of your population that are needing support from services and could put demand on resources as such. So across all of those areas that we projected, 92.2% of the areas were likely to see an increase in dependency ratio between 2018 and 2024. So this is a general trend that we're seeing across a lot of areas within Scotland, and it's quite important to understand when planning for services. And this is something that these projections allow you to see. So this is just giving you a sense of what overall the projections are showing for the whole of Scotland. But these are the types of things that you can look at in more detail for specific council areas. and look at how it varies between different areas. So especially when you think of things like how your population is likely to grow or decline, it's important that you see how that varies between the different areas within councils, and the same with dependency ratios. If you can see how it varies within your council, it allows you to sort of plan for where resources are likely to be needed, where there's likely to be vulnerable populations, where there might be areas of highly dense populations. So this is just giving you a sense of what can be done with these projections and why you might be interested in looking at them a bit further.
So I'm just going to touch on why you might use population projections and how they can be applied in your work. So firstly, if you work with anything that involves people, then you need to know what that population is going to look like in the future. Population projections are really important to help us understand what the future context that we might operate in, that we might deliver services in the future it will look like. So it's important that councils and other partners, they account for the challenges and opportunities that a changing population structure might present, and that when they're making decisions now and when they're making decisions in the future, they're situating that within the future context that of what their population is going to look like. Sub-council population projections are even more useful, in my opinion, because they provide a more detailed insight into what's happening below the council level, and population size and structure could really vary considerably across different areas in the council. Some areas might have, for example, a much older population structure. And that allows us then to think about where services might need to be delivered in the future. So population projections, as I've touched on, they help us understand what the population size might be in the future, what structure might be in terms of an age breakdown or a male-female sex breakdown. They help us understand which areas are most likely to experience change and how the population is likely to change. So is change being driven by internal, external migration? Is it being driven by a high fertility rate, for example? And sub-council projections can help us understand how the future size and structure of the population of an area is likely to vary across the council, and how the rate of change varies across these areas. So just to give some examples of specific service areas that might make use of population projections, one area that you might need to know what the population looks like in the future is in assessing housing need, which areas are most likely to see the highest populations. It's either useful for demand assessments. So for example, in early years or education provision, are you going to have a high number of under fives, a high number of 5 to 18-year-olds, or a high number of older people who might need social care provisions, so the 65 plus, the 75 plus, the 85 plus age groups that have sometimes quite acute care needs. And healthcare planning is another important area linked to the age structure of an area. So we know that certain age groups are much more likely to face certain health conditions. And so by having that kind of more detailed breakdown of what your age structure is like a smaller area, it helps to plan where services are going to need to be delivered into the future. And just to highlight, some local authorities are using these projections now. So this is just some user feedback we've had from a specific local authority about how they're going to use the population projections that the improvement service has produced. I'm not going to read through all of this, but the idea is that they are going to share it with local area-based services and organisations, and also use that as a comparator data set for their school role projections work. So it's just to highlight that services do use this. They need to understand what their populations might look like in the future and think about how they're going to deliver services going forward.
So now that we've heard a bit about what the projections are and why you want to use them, I'm going to give you a run through of what sort of products we've actually produced as part of the project and how you can actually go about using these projections yourself. So we've got a lot of resources that we've created, and there's a lot of additional things that the NRS have also done that will be able to support you. So first of all, if you actually want to get a hold of the projections and take a look yourself, you can find these on the Improvement Service website. So if you go onto the Improvement Service website, under Products and Services, Data and Intelligence, there's a tab called Sub-Council Area Population Projections, and you'll come to this page here, which gives you a lot of background about the project and how to download all of the different files that we've created. This here, you've got the a lot of different materials such as the background reading. So I'll just show you the project overview document that we've got. So this basically just gives an outline of a lot of what we've covered here about what the project was, what these projections are, and how we went about doing completing this project. So that's useful just for getting a sense of what the work involved. We've also got a detailed methodology note which explains all the assumptions that we've made in producing the projections and just goes into a bit more detail than what we've covered here in terms of how the projections are actually produced using the PopGroup software, and what things you need to be aware of when you're interpreting the projections. And if you want to get a bit more detail about really some of the kind of things that you should be aware of, there is also a cautions and caveats booklet that can be downloaded. And this basically details for each of the different councils. It shows for any of the small areas within those councils any caveats that there are to the projections and anything that you need to be aware of. So it mainly kind of highlights where there's areas that have got special populations present. So for example, students or prisoner populations, what we've done to account for that within the projection and what you need to be aware of. Also things like where there's a population that's particularly small, this can have an impact on the projection just because of the volatility of these small areas. So if there's anything that you are want to check up on, if you look on this document, it'll show for your council and the different small areas that have been projected what things you need to be aware of. And just in terms of thinking about the different small areas that we have projected, we've got a geography lookup table which tells you what data zones have been used to create the different sub-council areas that we've actually projected. So this is good for understanding what areas are actually included in the small area that you're looking at, and to get a sense of what boundaries that covers. So that's all detailed in there. So like I said, all of that can be downloaded from this page here. And just if you go to the downloads page, this will give you the actual projections themselves and all the files that you need for looking at that. So the first thing to look at is the national summary document. And this document basically gives an overview of all of the sub-council area projections for all 32 councils. So there's a tab for each council, and within that tab it has each of the small areas that were projected for that council, and it shows you the overall population within each of the projected years up to 2030. So this just gives you a general sense of what is the population likely to look like across the time period for these different small areas. And there's also this sheet at the start called All, which puts all of the councils together in case you want to make any general comparisons between council areas and between different small areas within these councils. And if you want to look more specifically at a detail of your own council, we've got both a summary table and detailed projections for each of the 32 councils. The summary file again has a different tab for each of the small areas that we've projected, and it gives a summary of the projection and the different components that went into that projection. So you've got, for each of the years, you've got the population at the start and the population at the end, and then this section here details how the different components that made up that change in population. So you've got your births, your deaths, which accounts for the natural change, so the overall change that occurred naturally each year. Then you've got the net migration, which has both inflows of migration and outflows of migration. So this shows you how many people are projected to move into the area versus move out of the area each year. And then we've also got the accounted for the special populations. So if there's any, that will be detailed here. And at the bottom, it shows basically each year what the overall change in population will be. And then, yeah, you've got the end population at the end of each year, because resulting from that overall change. It also calculates the annual percentage change in population and the percentage change from the base year of 2018. So that's just allows you to quickly glance and see what's the different growth in population or decline in population across your different small areas. And then we've also got at the bottom here just an overview of the fertility and mortality within each of your small areas and over the projection period. So you've got total fertility rate and the standardised mortality ratio for each gender, and then also a life expectancy estimate. So this has got a lot of useful information for understanding in more detail what's happening within to make up those projections for each year within the small areas. And then we've also got the detailed projections, and again a different tab for each of the small areas that have been projected, and within those tabs it gives you a breakdown of the projection for each age group and each gender. So you've got here at the top all ages and from 0 to 90 plus, and what the projected population for that age group is likely to be across all of the years. So that's for persons, so that's both male and female. And then just below you've got a breakdown for the age groups for males and a breakdown of the age groups for females. So this is quite useful if you want to calculate the number of people within a certain age group that's projected to be in your area. So for example, if you're planning for earlier services, you might want to look at the projected number of 3 and 4 year olds, and you can also calculate dependency ratios from this table. So yeah, there's a lot of detailed information there and a lot of breakdowns that should allow you to do different calculations on your small area. And we do have this data available in a long format if people would like to use it in programming languages such as R. But there's all of this detail can be found on the website, like I said, and if there's anything that you are unsure of, we do also have a tab down here for FAQs, and these really just cover a lot of the stuff that we've mentioned in this presentation today, and any sort of quick answers to questions that you might have concerning the projections, anything that you're interested in. But we're also available if there's any particular questions that you'd like answered, or anything that you'd like us to look at. And so, like I said, there's a lot of information there to allow you to do a lot of interesting analysis on your own area. But we've also, as part of the project, worked with the NRS to develop, they've developed other resources that people might like to use if they'd like to go beyond what has been produced as part of this standard national set. So if you go onto the NRS website, under population and household projections for sub-council areas, there's this tab for user guidance and support. And this just details the different, it gives a lot of detail about the project that we've carried out with the NRS, and it also gives you information about how you can develop on the project. So we recognise that this standard set of projections might not all cover all the areas that people are interested in, or we might have made assumptions that people would like to change. So the resources that the NRS have produced are there to help people that would like to either produce their own set of projections or build on the projections that we've made. So as part of this support, they've produced user guidance. So this is a document that shows how to use the PopGroup software when producing these kinds of projections. And this is the document that we used whilst we were producing our set of projections. So it's quite useful to have and gives you all the detail that you need to produce it yourself. And as part of that, the NRS had also created a range of instructional videos which show how to create the projections in PopGroup. But they've also got a lot of stuff that's quite useful for looking at different demographic data and what it shows, how these things are calculated, and what you need to think about when you're looking at projections and thinking about producing these. And lastly, the NRS have also produced this data utility tool. So when creating the projections, we used NRS data for the base population figures and the sort of birth and death figures for our starting years. And this then allowed us to input this into the PopGroup software and create our own set of projections. And so the NRS created all of this for us in the format we needed for PopGroup and for the different sub-council areas that we had defined within the project. But if users would like to create their own set of projections, perhaps using different sub-council areas, then those input files would need to be produced again for the specific areas. So what the NRS have done is created this data utility tool, which allows you to define what your areas are, and this will automatically populate the input files that you need for those areas that can then be used within the PopGroup software. So this is quite useful for allowing you to do it yourself, but taking it, helping with sort of the starting point and taking away some of the more time-consuming work in creating projections. So what we've tried to do with this project is to provide a standard national set of sub-council area projections to fill a data gap that there was previously. And we hope that these will allow councils and other stakeholders to analyse what's likely to happen to their populations within their sub-council areas, and use this to inform different service planning. But the resources that the NRS have also produced mean that people can build on those, create their own assumptions, and ensure that for those that have the capacity, they can adapt the projections to suit their needs. And so if anybody is interested in doing so, we have the input and output files that we used in our projections. They could be made available if anyone wants to use them, and that will allow you to see what we've done and build on that yourself, and with this support that the NRS have also provided. So there's the whole project, all in all, has provided a range of different resources, and we'd be keen to hear how you're using them, if there's anything else that you think would be useful, and any questions that you might have. So just like to stop there and just to say thanks for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and we hope that you found it useful, but please get in touch if there's anything else that you'd like to see.